Outstanding. Thank you, Sir Liam. Do we have a question?
For the presentation. I'm Marta Dade from Albania, and last week there was a very important meeting of the Political Council between EU countries and larger, with the participation of Turkey, Azerbaijan, Armenia, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, and of course Zelensky was also participating. So the European Union and the main leaders of it reaffirmed their determination to assist and help and continue with the support for Ukraine. Do you think that the European Union is drawing lessons from the past, as you mentioned, Crimea, and are you optimistic that they are doing their job? Because we know the region of the Western Balkans is in the vicinity of Ukraine, and of course people are concerned about this conflict, which is going to the end, because there were voices that it would not last. And practically it is lasting and it's becoming even more serious. Of course we are doing the job in Albania and other countries in the eastern side of NATO, but do you think the European Union itself is doing enough by, of course, adding some more of the sanctions to Russia? Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you very much. It's an excellent question. When the sanctions were imposed in 2014, Russia moved most of its assets to Europe rather than the United States because they believed that there would not be sufficient European solidarity in the face of Russian aggression. And the thing that does make me feel optimistic is how solid we have been right across the West in dealing with Russia's aggression. We've so far spent between Europe and, broader Europe, not just the EU, but including UK, Norway, Turkey, we've spent 282 billion supporting Ukraine. There's 300 billion more assets sitting there if we want to use them. It will take quite a degree of political will to do that. But I think what has been encouraging has been the fact that there's been such an understanding that our failure of deterrence up till this point cannot continue. And faced with the necessary defense of freedom and rule of law and democracy, this is the time we actually have to stand together. Because I do believe, as I was saying, that there's a growing awareness that Putin will not stop. Anything that gives Putin reassurances that he can have a strategic pause but start again at a later date will simply guarantee further instability and death and destruction on the European continent. This is the point at which we have to make a stand. And so far, it's been extremely good. I just hope that the United States doesn't decide for whatever reason that it doesn't want to be part of the coalition that stands against tyranny and aggression in support of international law and freedom.
Thank you. Very quickly, if you could, please.
Yes, Sir Liam. I'm Senator Corlețean, ex-foreign minister of Romania, working hard at the time with my colleague, counterpart and friends William Hague, and for a certain period with the Defense Secretary Michael Fallon. Because you have mentioned also Romania plus the Republic of Moldova as possible items of interest of Russia, I entirely agree with your assessment. We know the profile. We don't have any fundamental expectations about possible fundamental changes on the profile of power in Kremlin, starting with Putin. So this is why I and we consider that we should continue to do and to continue to promote our assessment and position. It was me that I proposed on 3rd of March 2014 in Brussels. Cathy Ashton was the High Representative chairing the meeting of the foreign ministers of EU. And I proposed not to express serious concerns, but to condemn Russia for the crime of aggression and the illegal annexation of Crimea, and to continue to do our job, because we know what is the profile of Russia. This is why this year we will adopt at the European level a special tribunal for assuring the accountability for the crime of aggression, and we need to continue. But the key element from our perspective in Bucharest is to ensure and to assure and to work hard that the transatlantic relationship will continue to remain solid. And this is a long-term process, and this is the key element for us. Thank you.
When I was the UK's Defence Secretary and Robert Gates was the American Defence Secretary, we used to have a routine at NATO which you might describe as bad cop and worse cop, when one would talk about the implications of European states not maintaining their defence budgets, and that was augmented by the fact that we would say in the long term you can't expect American taxpayers to continue to carry the burden of European defence as well as defence in Asia and the Americas and so on. The European nations didn't take notice of that in the first Trump term. They've taken notice of it in the second term, and that's a good thing. I think it will strengthen the alliance as a whole, that European nations carry a bigger share of their burden. My worry is that it's not just about money, it's about what they do with the money and about how capacity and capability is built, rather than countries trying to pretend that they can have full spectrum defence capabilities on a small budget. But I think it's key politically, as you mentioned, that we don't allow Putin to develop any cracks around the periphery of our wider alliance, which is what he does try to do. He's tried to create an arc of instability around NATO, from the high north to the Baltics, to the Balkans, to the Caucasus, and he will continue to do that because his behaviour pattern doesn't change. And what I would say, perhaps on a slightly optimistic note, is that people say that Russia has survived the sanctions intact. It hasn't. There are big cracks appearing in the Russian economy, and the longer the conflict goes on, the bigger the contradictions inside the Russian economy become. It's had growth because it has pumped money against its own fiscal rules into the armaments and into the armed forces. That always produces growth if you're looking at technical OECD definitions of growth, but in the longer term it's unsustainable. And we must not become fatigued at the length of the time this conflict has taken, because this is an existential battle and we have to win it.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Quickly, if you could.
Thank you. Your Excellency, how do you see the Chinese position in this conflict? Would you think that China would like to see a peace soon in the European battle, or prefer that it perdure in time?
China would like to see the West weakened. It would like to see the alliance that we have fractured, because that's in the long-term interests of China. And while our biggest weakness is that we tend to think in electoral terms of 4 or 5 years, and Putin doesn't have to bother about his electoral cycle. The Chinese don't think in electoral cycles at all. So if they can have a gradual fracturing, a gradual weakening, a gradual tearing apart of the intellectual and political coherence that has made the West strong and wealthy, then it will do so. Not overtly in the way that Russia does, because they're much more subtle than the gangster regime in Moscow, but the danger is there, even if it's presented in a more subtle form.
Thank you. Sorry for my English. I don't know if I can ask my question in French, but I will try in English. Contrary to what I heard from every presenter, from the African perspective, we are seeing the influence of Russia increasing, and the influence of Europe decreasing, and the economic in Europe decreasing, the inflation increasing in Europe. So when you say that we have to keep going, fighting, is it the only way to solve this issue? we have a new threat with China, for instance. You have a new threat with, how you say, Cuba and some African country under influence of Russia. So, do you think keeping this war, feeding this war, is in the advantage of Europe and even Ukraine, with all those deaths and so on? Because since maybe the beginning of the war in 2023. They said that in 1 year, Russia will collapse. In 2 years, Russian economy will collapse. But it's not what we have seen all over the world. So,
well, there are two questions there, if I may. The first is that we are not feeding the war. We are defending a sovereign and democratic state against a brutal tyranny that tries to impose its will. And let me give you an African analogy to that. Putin says they are allowed to own Ukraine because it was once part of the Soviet Union. Supposing France turned around tomorrow and said, we want to occupy Algeria because it was once part of France. What do you think the international reaction would be to that? So let's be very clear that this is a colonial action by Russia. And it surprises me that a number of African countries who complain about the legacy of colonialism are not more vocal in their criticism of what is a clearly colonial policy being operated by today's Kremlin. The second part of your question, which I have much more sympathy with, is what has been the Western alternative to China's Belt and Road policy? And the answer is pathetically little. I was the UK's candidate to be the Director General of the World Trade Organization, and I felt that one of the changes we needed to make, particularly for African countries, was to call it the World Trade and Investment Organization, because one of the things that we could do is to help African countries become much more attractive to foreign direct investment and become masters of their own destiny by that method. And we need to do much more in the West to have a strategic alternative to Chinese Belt and Road that's been missing from our diplomatic armory in recent times. And one of the ways that we can do that is to actually allow African countries to develop in a way that makes them more attractive to the massive amount of international capital that could be helping to take Africa forward in a way that is in line with what the countries want and not what Beijing wants, and not leaving African countries with a legacy of debt and useless infrastructure, which is what a lot of them are finding they're left with Belt and Road.